Happy Sabbath, everyone. Hope you're having a great day. Today I want to talk about facial hair, flesh, and my alma mater, BYU, and other church institutions, and the church more broadly. This idea of outward appearances versus inward commitments. And why do we have these rules in the first place? Do they mean anything? Are they substantive? And do they support us in our spiritual journey? This isn't a trivial thing, of course, because, a lot of people care about this. A lot of people are torn over this. And I think it has broader implications than just having a beard, as I do. I just trimmed it the other day for those of you watching live. It was getting kind of shaggy. So I went to BYU, and, it's kind of interesting to reflect on that because my career nowadays, my life is completely different from why I went to school. Different topic for another day, but in reflection, I wish I never went. That was never really an option that was presented to me. I thought that I had to. That's just what you did. So I went to BYU. And, at the time, I probably couldn't have grown much of a beard if I tried. It wasn't really an issue for me. But what was an issue for me was this question of the standards that we are adhering to and how these standards were created and why they exist. So, BYU, like other church institutions, has this dress and grooming code. And, it's not unreasonable. Lots of organizations have standards by which they kind of judge members or maintain a certain set of appearances to try and project something to customers or clients or the public. And so it's not unheard of, it's not unreasonable for an institution like BYU to say, here are the parameters that are acceptable for coming to our institution. And then, of course, the people like me who went to that school agree to do so. We voluntarily say, much like joining an HOA, that we will abide by the standards that we're agreeing to. But that doesn't mean that we can't analyze them. That doesn't mean that we can't criticize them. And worse, that doesn't mean that we can't be concerned when those standards, which pertain directly to one single institution, are more broadly applied or suggested that they apply to the church and to our religiosity and our spirituality and our standing before God, as sometimes happens in our church culture. This isn't just about, BYU students. This is about what a good, disciple of Christ or member of the church must look like. And these implications have been suggested by the very leaders who have supported these dress and grooming standards. So, to start at BYU, where I went, and this is not, just for BYU, of course. We'll get into a few other examples. But at BYU, you're expected as men to be clean-shaven. Beards are not acceptable. Sideburns are allowed, but they should not extend below the earlobe or onto the cheek. Mustaches must be neatly trimmed and may not extend beyond or below the corners of the mouth. And then it says that these standards are consistent with the dignity adherent to representing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and any of its institutions of higher education. And see, that is the problem, right? That my beard, for those of you watching, not listening later, but if you're watching live, right, you can see my beard. It's well-groomed and whatever. But the idea that this beard is not adherent to the dignity representing the church, that is where I take issue. I have no problem if BYU wants to say, like, hey, look, we just want this for our students and we think it's important, but, we have no suggestion that this has any broader implication or relevance to your connection to the church or anything like that. Okay, fine, right? I'm not going to quarrel with you there. That's like an HOA saying that you can't paint your fence pink. Right, big whoop. Few people got together and decided that, and we can try and oppose that or overtake the HOA through a majority of whatever. And that's just bureaucratic, organizational, mortal, fallible, whatever, right? Stupidity, I'll call it. And we can recognize it as such, right? It's just some people exerting control on others and saying, here are the parameters that we want everyone to abide by. And then there are means by which you can push against that, remedy that, and fight for something different. But when the implication, and not just the implication, but when the outright affirmation is that, to have dignity in representing the church more broadly and standing before God, right? That beards are not acceptable. That sideburn that goes down to your cheek, a mustache that goes below the corner of your mouth is suddenly, you lose that dignity in representing the church. That is where the problem comes in, and that is where I take issue. Well, Dallin H. Oaks, who is currently in the first presidency, in 1971, he was the president of BYU. And this is as they were starting to enact the beard ban. And so he gave an address to the students as president of BYU. And he said that our rules against beards and long hair are contemporary and pragmatic. He said the beard and long hair are associated with protest, revolution, and rebellion against authority. They are also symbols of the hippie and drug culture. Persons who wear beards or long hair, whether they desire it or not, may identify themselves with or emulate and honor the drug culture or the extreme practices of those who have made slovenly appearance a badge of protest and dissent. In addition, unkemptness, which is often, though not always associated with beards and long hair, is a mark of indifference towards the best in life. So here's President Oaks as president of BYU arguing in favor of the beard ban because those who have it are slovenly in their appearance. In other words, they're lazy, they're unkempt. They are associated, whether they intend for it or not, with the hippie and drug culture, not just in emulating it, but in honoring it. And that they are kind of part of protest, revolution, and rebellion against authority. Well, we can quibble with this in a number of ways, right? 1971, I could have had a beard not unlike the one I have now. Very, well-groomed, very short. It's not big, hippie, long hair, whatever. And I'm going to be swept in with all these other people who maybe do stand for hippie and drug culture, as an example. Why am I going to get lumped in? Does the Lord kind of group people and, oh, you're sinning there and you're related to them or you look like them, therefore, I'm going to classify you the same? Well, no, like the Lord treats us individually. We don't have collective sin. We're not held accountable for Adam's transgression just because we're related to him. And so I really don't like this idea of, because some people promoted and honored the hippie and drug culture, therefore everyone who had a beard did, whether they intended to or not. So we're going to lump all of you together. And even if you have a very kind of well-kempt beard, any facial hair whatsoever, we're going to sweep you in with all those guys and just ban the full thing. And then, of course, on the flip side, it's, we no longer associate culturally, and that's an interesting word that maybe I'll get into later. I wrote about that in my recent book, what culture actually means, but it's part of the cult. But our culture no longer really associates beards with that type of thing, and yet BYU still doubles down, and other church institutions as well, and in banning facial hair for reasons that decades ago were quite different than they are today. What's interesting is President Oaks, in that very same speech in 1971, anticipated a change. He said, "I'd be surprised if someday, this rule was still in place." He acknowledged that it was, as he called it, contemporary, right, to the issues, the cultural issues that they were responding to at the time. So even President Oaks at the time was acknowledging a future change. And here we are half a century later, right, and we see how stubborn people can be in the traditions of our fathers. In other words, that's no longer an issue. The hippie drug culture associations are no longer there. And yet people have become so accustomed to the way things have always been that they are unwilling to let go. They are unwilling to adapt. It almost becomes an admission of like, oh, maybe there isn't something spiritual here. Maybe there isn't something, of a higher law here. And by eliminating this ban, we're going to acknowledge that fact. It was like they were acknowledging it on the front end, and yet people have become kind of near Pharasaical in how this stuff works and don't want to let it go. And I'll touch more on that in just a moment and share one of the most powerful quotes, I think, on this stuff from Hugh Nibley that I've always found very interesting. And so, this is not something that's associated just with BYU. I'll mention a couple examples in a moment. But what I love is just recently, I think within the past few months, there's this BYU professor who organized a petition calling on the church, the school administration, to get rid of the ban. And this professor has been involved and interested in this issue for many years. Well, he organizes this petition. And so the BYU spokesperson issues a response in the press, and they said, the dress and grooming standards, which outline how BYU has chosen to represent itself, reflect the highest standards of the university and the church. So again, here is where I take issue in saying that's fine if you want to say, hey, we got together, we mortal men, and sat around a table and said, we still think beards are bad. Like, I'm going to disagree with you, but I'm going to acknowledge your right as a private institution to set the parameters of, associating with your institution. I have no legal, political, ethical problem with you doing that, but keep it confined to that. Because the moment you start to say that that reflects the highest standards of the church, we then have to take a step back and say, whoa, wait a minute, like how did that creep in? Who defined that? And when did that become true? Of course, because the earliest leaders of the modern church and Jesus himself and countless others have all had beards. They all had facial hair. Did they not reflect the highest standards of the church? Did the standards change? Who is the arbiter of what those standards are, and what are the criteria upon which we change them? How do we keep track of that? Where are the kind of rules and the rule book that we can follow and make sure that we're always up to date with the cultural evolutions of the highest standards of the church? I would find that very interesting. Another thing I found interesting was years ago I wrote a blog post about this, and I shared a photo of this individual who was in, do you remember when the church was doing their Bible videos? These are all available. I think it's just biblevideos.org or something like that. And they're great. They're filmed down in Goshen at the little set that they built that The Chosen recently used in season 2. So you get this Jerusalem set, and they were building this elaborate set, having all these actors come participate and filming these videos. And it was an amazing, great production, and they've made them available to the whole world for free, etc. They're good to kind of see a reenactment of some of these Bible scenes. Well, there was this individual who I came across years ago when I was writing this blog post, who was a student at the LDS Business College. I believe it's now called the Ensign College, when we had to drop all the LDS kind of stuff. And he was an actor in this production. And so he had to get an exemption to the anti-beard rule at that school, as exists at, I think, all church schools of higher education. And so he had to sign this elaborate contract to get the consent to have a beard while remaining a student in good standing. That contract, in part, required that, in fact, let me see if I can find, I've got it right here. I'm going to read to you what he was required to do. Here it is. So the letter stated, among other requirements, that he was, quote, required to dress professionally in a shirt and tie as a way to compensate for not shaving, and is required to wear a lanyard stating that he had an official authorization to wear a beard. So I'm going to show those of you who are watching live. If you're listening, you can just imagine this, but for those of you watching live, here's the photo of this guy. Oops, as my light is falling. So here's this guy who acted in one of the church's things. He's wearing you can see a shirt, tie, and he's literally wearing like this scarlet letter, right? This lanyard around his neck saying, and it says, beard exception in big letters. Beard exception, valid through December 31st, 2014. I was reading the fine print there. How ridiculous is this? Like this is literally a Mormon scarlet letter of oh, this person he's not unrighteous. He's my heavens. And not all schools, for those who have beard exceptions, at BYU, you could just keep your beard card in your wallet if you had a medical reason or you were acting or something like this. So I think this school in particular was unique in its requirement that you literally wear it on a lanyard around your neck. And I just find it fascinating, right? Because this is an individual who is, as an actor, trying to channel himself and his energies into what he's about to do. Presumably maybe he was an apostle or one of the believers or whatever, and he's trying to place himself in this mindset of watching Jesus call out Pharisees, and talk about the higher law and love and everything. And here he is himself in his real life dealing with all these nitpicky, weird things that I think are totally inconsistent with that mindset he was trying to place himself into. And I don't know, I just find that ironic. Another thing, so of course, we talk about BYU, we talk about LDS Business College. I mean, at BYU in the 70s, women were having to fight to wear pants. That took a while to overturn. But BYU-Idaho goes a step further, right? It's not just facial hair, it's flesh of any kind. So in BYU-Idaho's dress and grooming standards, it says that pants, slacks, or jeans should not be in poor condition, frayed or torn, and must be ankle length. Caps or hats should not be worn in buildings. Shoes should be worn in all public campus areas. Flip-flops and other casual footwear are inappropriate on campus. Shorts are not appropriate campus attire. Okay, so like this is just mind-boggling to me, right? Because why? Like, I've never really understood how this has come to be. And some people over the years have been like, oh, it's cold in Idaho, and fine, but let people choose. The fact that you can't wear flip-flops, you can't wear shorts, like, how ridiculous is this that they even have this requirement? And again, I will defend to my dying day their right as a private institution to enact rules like this. I am not questioning that they have the ability, the authority to do that, but the audacity to do it is where I kind of take issue, especially when people start to conflate these requirements with the gospel. And so the president of BYU-Idaho, this was in 2014, I think as President Clark at the time, he had his little 15 seconds of fame because acting on these dress and grooming standards, he wrote a Facebook post, and I shared this back in 2014. It blew up. It became my highest engagement post that I had, done in all my years on Facebook at that point, because people were freaking out that this was a thing. Here's what he says. This is again 2014. Good afternoon. I had the opportunity yesterday to get out of my office to visit this display in the quad. It was inspiring, blah, blah, blah. While out and about yesterday, I noticed that a few of you, and it was a few, may need a refresher or perhaps an introduction to 3 items in the dress and grooming standards. The 3 things that caught my eye yesterday were pants that did not make it down to the ankle, parentheses, some hemmed off 4 to 8 inches above the ankle, some pants rolled up that far, end parentheses. Number 2, faces of young men not clean shaven. And number 3, shorts on campus, parentheses, mostly BYU-Idaho shorts. Just remember to wear warm-ups. He continues, you may wonder why the president of BYU-Idaho, okay, so here's the issue. He says, you may wonder why the president of BYU-Idaho would spend time on these small things. Here is the reason. The dress and grooming standards are one of those small things on which big things depend. Obedience in the small things creates a spirit of obedience in all things. And obedience brings the blessings of heaven to you individually and to the whole campus community. I hope you will help each other be obedient, even in these small but important things. What in the world? Like, here was President Bednar. He used to be president of, I think it was Rick's College at the time. It became BYU-Idaho. But he said, the honor code, which involves the dress and grooming standards, is a lesser law preparation to enter the house of the Lord and make sacred covenants. And the dress code is a lesser law preparation for how you will dress and should act after you have entered into those covenants. So are we saying that after you've gone to the temple, you can't wear shorts? You can't have a beard? You can't wear flip-flops? The dress and grooming of both men and women should always be modest, neat, clean, and consistent with the values and principles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But you can go to the temple and have a beard, right? It is harder to get into BYU and BYU-Idaho to boot than it is to go to the temple, right? So when we talk about these standards and we talk about these values of the church, we're talking about elevated standards beyond anything that is required of people to get into the temple, the house of the Lord, where we make and keep these sacred covenants. And the implication that once you do that, you're going to want to continue adhering to these dress and grooming standards, I think is rubbish. I just think it's ridiculous. I remember a few years ago, I was speaking with my wife's grandfather, and they were over for her grandparents were over for a family event, and my beard came up in conversation. I don't remember how, and I jokingly said, "Well, yeah, like this means I'll never be called into a bishopric." And he turned to me kind of somewhat solemnly, and he said, "Well, but if you were asked to, if you were called to be in a bishopric, and they asked you to shave your beard, you would do it, right?" And I turned to him, I said, "No, I wouldn't, because I don't think it has anything to do with my ability to serve and fulfill that calling. I think it is a tradition of some of our fathers. I think it is a lazy, outward, Pharisaical requirement that has nothing to do with our inward spirituality and our ability to love our fellow man and love God. And it's a distraction from what we should be focused on. So I would happily serve, absolutely, notwithstanding my joke that this is like, how I can stay out of such service and not have to assume that type of responsibility. But if I was asked, I totally would. But I would politely and respectfully decline an invitation or requirement to shave. Not because I'm Samson with my beard hair or anything, and, I used to not have a beard, now I do. I happen to prefer it, even though my wife and kids are always telling me I should shave. I like it. I like my beard. And I don't think it has anything to do with my standing before God, my ability to love other people and serve them. And if anything, I mean, you might say, like, maybe President Oaks was right that the beard is a sign of protest half a century ago. And maybe to that end, it is still a little bit within the church today, where there's a part of me that's like, to the extent my beard or any beard is perceived to be incongruent with the highest standards of the church, I think it's a way to further that conversation and say, no, it isn't. It's not. Let it go. Get rid of this Pharisaical junk from decades past, right? Let's recognize that one's outward appearance, like, what does it say in 1 Samuel 16, right? In fact, I wrote it down here because I'm not good at memorizing. The Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. I mean, beards were even widely accepted and encouraged through the early 1900s. In some of the European missions, they required you to grow a beard because they said that facial hair added dignity. And so to my wife's grandpa, I said, no, I wouldn't. And he was just dumbfounded. I mean, he kind of took that personally. He thought I'd be defying the priesthood authority and whatever. I'm like, look, I am happy, I'm willing to serve. But just because I wear a blue shirt to church or don't wear a tie sometime or have a beard is in no way a reflection on who I am and where I stand before God. We have to figure out how better to get away from the outward appearance stuff, this Pharisaical notion that we can demonstrate our righteousness through outward actions and performances and dress and behavior. I mean, like, I think the Pharisees, for their part, were far more concerned with, like, fanatical obedience to these unimportant rules than to the underlying principles and truths of the gospel. I mean, Jesus called them out for hypocrites, right? For enlarging the borders of their robes and increasing the size of their phylacteries. Do you remember what these were? The phylacteries were, they had these little blocks on their forehead and on their upper left arm that they'd kind of wrap around their arm. And in there were written a few verses, which were the kind of requirements to do this type of thing, to always remember the Lord. And there were many people who would make those things bigger. The fringe on their kind of prayer shawl and these on their robes, they would make them long and big and noticeable. And Jesus was calling them out because these people were trying to demonstrate their piety by these outward things. And I think that is the problem we run into today. Jesus also called them out for being whited sepulchers, this idea that you can kind of sanitize the exterior and have it presented a certain way, when inside, he said, they're full of dead men's bones and uncleanliness, according to the law of Moses, right? But still, the idea that like you can have this like projection of who you are. Hey, I'm clean shaven and I wear a white shirt and tie, but I may be a vile person that cheats and lies and, doesn't love other people or whatever. And we get so fixated on the outward stuff. We look at people wearing masks in church as a predictor, until a few days ago at least, of like who's complying with the leaders of the church. And now the leaders of the church on that issue of vaccines and masks and so forth have deferred to a local level. And yet that in itself creates danger too, because then you get local leader roulette, right? Where, I mean, I hear from some people and they're like, oh, we have a bishopric counselor who has a beard. And then we have a friend of mine in another ward who, when he was called to it, the stake president told him to shave, right? And in some wards, this weekend, since the new council was released from the first presidency saying that the COVID compliance stuff is now being pushed to a local level, they're kind of washing their hands of it and allowing local leaders, which makes sense. There's adaptation and hotspots in different areas or whatever. But the flip side of that kind of local governance issue is that you get complete inconsistency. And when you still tie it to spirituality, are you following your leaders? Are you obeying, right? You get this inconsistency that creates its own problems, because I can be compliant in this zip code, but suddenly if I'm the exact same person doing the exact same thing and I attend a ward in another zip code or down the street even, right, I can suddenly be disobedient. For this president of BYU-Idaho to say that obedience in the small things is important is ridiculous, when those small things have nothing to do with loving God and loving other people, have nothing to do with divine inspiration or a commandment from God. When mortal leaders are imposing upon us, which is their right, again, they have the right to require kids at BYU-Idaho to not wear flip-flops and shorts. They have that right. But when they associate obedience with that to obedience with God, that is when I take issue, because we're not teaching obedience to God, we're teaching obedience. And that creates its own dangers, because then you're creating this serf-like saint who does not do their own thinking, who does not understand the nuance of revelation versus, fallible people and making our own decisions and forging the path God wants us to. We're led like sheep to the slaughter. I think it's what leads to, a lot of Latter-day Saints supporting all kinds of authoritarian politicians. You get this blend of authority where the religious positions and attitudes we have gets carried over into this broader context of, well, we should obey, right? We talked about that on a past episode about the 12th Article of Faith and D&C 134 and what civil disobedience means. But when we are told to be obedient, period, I think it creates problems. I want to be obedient to God. I want to know what God wants me to do. I'm not that interested in being obedient to the minutia and the mandates and the unjust, sometimes even immoral, evil things that my fellow men want me to do or want others to do. And so I think we have to have the spirit of discernment. But when you get a spiritually lazy people, when you breed that laziness by telling people to just be obedient, period, and that blessings will come from not wearing shorts on BYU-Idaho campus, you confuse people. You blur the lines, I think, between what we're supposed to do, and according to God, and what we're told to do by people who are well-meaning. Again, I don't ascribe any malice to this, but I think there comes in spiritual danger when you create this confusion, as people have. And so it's great to push this down to a local level, but I think when you get that inconsistency, it creates its own problems. So here's this Hugh Nibley quote I wanted to share. Maybe some of you have heard it before, but I've pondered this a lot in recent years. Guy was, never a leader of the church, whatever. He's just an academic curmudgeon that wrote a lot and had some amazingly insightful views. But this one has really stayed with me ever since that. I think I encountered this quote back in 2014 when I was writing about this and thinking about it for my blog. So here's what Hugh Nibley said. The worst sinners, according to Jesus, are not the harlots and the publicans, but the religious leaders, with their insistence on proper dress and grooming, their careful observance of all the rules, their precious concern for status symbols, their strict legality, their pious patriotism. The haircut becomes the test of virtue in a world where Satan deceives and rules by appearances. Hugh Nibley, you'll remember, is the one who, in a commencement prayer at BYU, he was a BYU professor, once said, we're dressed in the robes of a false priesthood, because they're all in their like big graduation robes. And anyways, guy had a number of interesting insights, but this one is so interesting, right? Because I don't think he's wrong. Jesus was very forgiving of these sinners, right? I know some of the best people I know today in terms of like being loving and helping others and having a big heart are people who have outward sins. You know, they smoke, they drink, they have been, unfaithful, whatever, but like they own that and they're trying and they have big hearts, and you can see that. And some of the people I know who are the most compliant in terms of the kind of minutia we've been talking about, some of the people who extol their obedience the most, I would classify as being on the opposite end of the spectrum of loving other people, because they are so eager to call out those who they deem disobedient. They are so eager to point out their own obedience as if that is an indicator of their righteousness. They are so quick to encourage others, as this BYU-Idaho president did, to be obedient in those small things because big things depend on it. And they fixate on the minutia. So how are they different from the Pharisees? Different group, different time, different circumstances, I get it. But the issue, I think, is the same. That's not to say the rules don't have their place and dress and grooming standards are inherently wrong or like any of these types of things. But when those minutia become the focus, then we lose focus of what's most important. So, of course, to this, a lot of people over the years have said, well, if you don't like it, then leave, right? This is the same in the political context. Like, oh, you don't like the laws where you live, then leave. You don't like the BYU, grooming standards, then leave. But Christ invited everyone to come to him. Not just those who are willing to like abide by some arbitrary standard, right? That has nothing to do with righteousness. And so isn't the real solution here just to admit that the beard ban and some of these standards are pointless and to get rid of them rather than doubling down and then telling people who have a problem with it to leave? Why drive people away over something that's so trivial? It is so easy to focus on the superficial rather than the substantive. And that, I think, is where our church culture has a problem, right? It's easy to slip into the Pharasaical nature of things because we have our checklists of what it means to be a good Latter-day Saint, of what a good Christian is. Oh, I don't smoke, and I don't see rated R movies, and I, wear white shirts to church with a tie. It's easy to do those things. And I think it's human nature to slip into those outward performances because they are easily perceived as a substitution for our spirituality. And we limit ourselves because we don't focus on the substantive. We stay at the milk level and we don't go to the meat. We fail to recognize that stuff is insufficient, that who cares probably in part of this same cultural protest, most of the time I go to church these days, I'm wearing a colored shirt without a tie, and I have a beard. And if I'm being honest and frank with you guys, it probably is for that very reason. Well, it's also more comfortable. And, if I spill something on a shirt with a design on it, it's less visible than a white shirt. There's pragmatic and other reasons why I've made that choice. But largely speaking, I no longer wear a white shirt and tie. And it's interesting too, because I sit, everyone, part of our culture is like everyone has their pew, and woe unto he who arrives at a ward and takes someone's pew that then causes that family to go to someone else's pew, and you create this like musical chairs effect, right? That just creates like Sunday instability. So our family, because my wife has long preferred it, sits right behind the deacons. That's kind of our go-to spot. And what's very interesting is watching those deacons when they need help. They need help passing the sacrament. They need warm bodies, priesthood holders to help. And I can't remember the last time they asked me. Probably the last time was like years ago when I had a white shirt. They'll walk right by me. I'm sitting right there, literally behind them, and they won't do it because I think they've been raised in this kind of perception that like, oh, you can't pass the sacrament. I remember on my mission in Honduras, the boys would all pass the sacrament and they would have their left hand tucked behind their back, right? And they would all do that. I mean, like militaristically, right? Just rigid and like that is what you did. And they would like correct one another if they saw someone not, oh, get your left hand up. Like, what does that have to do with anything? We need to focus on the substantive issues here. Who cares what color dye was used in the cotton with which I've clothed my body? And I get that in some circumstances, like the temple or whatever, there is symbolic importance in, when we're like engaged in these ordinances to be part of that symbolism. So I'm not knocking that. I'm not saying standards are bad. I'm not doing any of that. But my point is that we so easily fixate on the minutia, and if someone is passing the sacrament and has a blue shirt on, ultimately, big whoop. Are we going to be distracted by it? Are we going to exclude them? Are we going to turn someone away, right, because they have a beard? I remember a few years ago, BYU quietly stopped giving religious exemptions to their students. And so you have a few people had, and I think still have at BYU, who are like Sikhs or Islamic or Orthodox Jews and sects within Judaism and Islam. For them, their beard is a matter of their faith. Being told to shave that is like us being told to go, chug whiskey. Like it's just anathema to their faith. And so BYU was not, they got called out publicly and then they walked it back and said, oh, no, okay, yeah, we'll do the religious exemptions. But for a period of time, they weren't. This institution predicated on, religion was denying this religious expression to other people. And I just think a lot of it is so unnecessary, so unhelpful. And I just worry about the broader implications of this because I think it deprives us of really pondering the substantive issues of the gospel if we fixate on all of this silly stuff that doesn't really matter. I think the Pharisees, in the end, were trying to create and enforce all of these man-made laws as a substitute for true righteousness, and as a weapon almost, right, to judge other people, to set themselves up above other people. And look, like, I get it, right? We can't judge other people. We don't know. In fact, I mean, think of the BYU-Idaho president whose statement I read, where he's calling out these students that he saw when he went for a walk on campus. Okay, so he saw someone who wasn't clean shaven. Maybe he was up all night caring for a sick roommate. I mean, maybe like there could be reasons behind these actions, even for those who have agreed to voluntarily abide by those standards. We probably should not judge those who fail to rise to the kind of standards of appearance that we required. At the end of the day, BYU and these institutions have every right to have these policies. I don't fault them for that. And I think it's important to talk about it because I remember years ago when I wrote about this, I got accused by several people in the comments of creating contention. Their position was, look at all the comments and the disagreement and the bickering and the, Connor, you're creating contention. And I had to pause. I wanted to process that and say, like, well, is that true? Like, am I doing something wrong here? Should I, right? Contention is of the devil. Should I not be talking about this? And then I got frustrated because are we not to talk about problems just because some people may disagree and that may create contention? I think that's one of the biggest problems in our culture is we're all nice, we're all polite, we don't want to rock the boat, we don't want to call anyone out, we don't want to say someone is wrong, we want to obey the small things because maybe we'll be blessed and then we'll be ready to obey the big things. And so we just keep our heads down and keep quiet and don't create any contention. But I think that's wrong. I mean, I get it. I understand it. I can even probably honor it a little bit, because I get that these people at the end of the day, they're nervous about their spiritual position. They're nervous about, being found outside of the faithful. They're nervous about, I don't have the ability to discern between, when I follow the prophet, when I can make my own decision. So I understand it. And I'm not, suggesting that it's inherently problematic, but the broader position is, to what end does it go? Should we just not talk about controversial issues or problems that we perceive because we don't want to offend someone? We don't want to create a circumstance in which there might be debate and disagreement, because, that might lead to contention. I think about Jesus, right? Think not that I am come to bring peace, but a sword, right? To set father against son and brother against brother. And we like to think of Jesus as the Prince of Peace, and he was and is, but, truth is a discriminating instrument. There are people who will disagree with it. When Jesus comes again, not everyone's going to be sunshine and rainbows. There's going to be a lot of, wailing and gnashing of the teeth. And I'm not saying that my position is 100% consistent with Jesus. I'm not conflating that, but my point is just that if Jesus and his teachings created contention, quote unquote, then I think there's room for us to discuss issues like this without being accused of creating contention. So I think BYU and all these institutions should drop all of these parameters. I think we should teach correct principles and let people govern themselves. I think we should say, yes, we want to project a good image to the world about the church's institutions and the church itself. And we want to be clean and well-kempt and, modest and all the rest. No problem with any of that. Focus on the abstract, conceptual, broad principle, and deal with the clear anomalies as they happen, rather than as an institution getting into this Pharasaical nitpicking of, a certain number of inches above the ankle, and that's a problem, and I'm going to call you out publicly. Let's not do that, because I think that's far worse than the opposite. The opposite being, let's have a bunch of slobs at BYU. I'd rather do that and focus on love and service and charity and the important gospel principles than have these Pharisaical Facebook posts where we nitpick at the length of people's hems. So yeah, I guess you can sense a common thread through some of these past videos and this one. And maybe future ones as well. I've got a long list of things that I'm looking forward to sharing, but I think the common thread so far is I am so desirous to have my family and my community and my ward and my friends focusing on a deeper level and not being stuck in the superficial. I used to teach gospel doctrine. You may recall, for those of you who've been listening or watching to these Sunday musings, that the first one started because I was going to substitute for a gospel doctrine class. I'm not currently the teacher, but in years past, I have been, and I really enjoy that calling. And what I think I enjoyed most is that I took opportunity to go deeper, which meant often setting aside the church's instruction manual, which is often rather superficial. And I had so many people come up to me and express gratitude for going into depth, for really unpacking a weighty issue, for having substantive, deeper discussion of the doctrines. I mean, it is gospel doctrine and not the gospel principles class, which you can understand for newcomers to our faith would be more simple. And so I have this desire to talk about the meat, meat of the gospel, to unpack the weightier matters of the law, as the scripture says. And unfortunately, I find that so often our church manuals and classes and culture and other things keep us at a superficial level. And look, some people are there, and that's fine, and I respect that, and I get it, and I don't want to cause problems for those people by introducing to them ideas that they're not ready for, or that they would find hard to kind of process and think through. But that doesn't mean that there aren't others of us out there who are interested in talking about those things, who do crave the meat, who don't want to be isolated in our own scripture study of deeper issues and interesting insights without being able to talk to other people and connect with people of like mind who are at a similar level. And if we can't do that in gospel doctrine, if we're not really getting it, where are we getting it? So I know a lot of you have reached out similarly with gratitude for these posts, and it's or these recordings, and it's fun for me, like it was back then, to teach, because it allows me to do my own study and my own thinking once again. After a few years of not really doing this, to reflect myself and to focus on these deeper issues and ponder, do I think differently than I did a few years ago? Have I learned anything different? What new insights have I gained? How can I share this with others? I do it from a place of love. I do it from a place of faith. I know that as we talk about these things, there are those who will say, oh, apostasy, oh, criticizing a church leader, oh, leading people down forbidden paths, and all these things that have long been used to shut down debate, to prevent nuance from coming into the discussion. And I think that's a problem. I am a very faithful person. I have a very strong testimony. I have no problem talking about these issues, and I wish we would talk about them more, because as a church, like, we're under condemnation. Maybe I'll save this for another episode, but we remain under condemnation because we've treated lightly the things that we've received. And if we don't set out to correct that, then when are we ever going to get, the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon, more revelation, more progress? How do we proceed line upon line when we're stuck with the traditions of our fathers that are weighing us down and focusing us on these Pharisaical little things that are completely irrelevant in the grander scheme of things? So consider this my invitation to go deeper, to ponder the weightier matters of the law, to not be critical for the sake of criticism. Again, I recognize the right of the church, of its institutions, to set these rules. I just wish that they would not conflate them with broader church values, with people's spirituality, with obedience to God, because it's not any of those things. And the sooner we move away from that conflating of the two, the sooner we drop this outward appearance baggage, then the sooner we can begin focusing more on our inward heart, our relationship with God, and showing other people that we are a peculiar people, not because of how we dress or what we do or do not drink, but because we love God, and it is clearly evident from how we behave and think and act. Have a great Sunday.